Energy Council is the global platform for all energies, basically, and we represented in more than 80 countries around the globe. And in our German member committee, almost 70 members from all energies. They will bring together discussing energy issues on the one hand side, international topics that we bring from the international level into a German context, but also the other way around, by studies, by conferences that we do, foster the exchange and an exchange on experiences, on policies, and bring that into the international debate from a German point of view as well. So that's what we're doing, and of course it's possible to get member. And with this, the advert is finished, and you're, of course, if you're interested, welcome to come back to us later. Now today's survey, maybe just a word for me in advance, because we're doing this exercise now for several years, actually since 2011, if I remember correctly, with the start of the so-called German Energiewende, at least with this heading. In former years, we called this survey that we are doing, asking people around the globe, energy experts around the globe, what is your perception of German Energiewende? We call that a blueprint to the world, as we were quite interested to see whether we do have an effect with what we're doing here in Germany on others. But I think today there's so many energy transitions already underway. Yeah, there's so many Energiewende transitions around the globe that we thought this narrow perspective on only do we have an effect on others is maybe a little bit too narrow, and we call it really our energy transition in this context, and how does that resonate from other people's standpoint and their background. That's what we are very interested to learn from. I'm very happy that we got such a good team that was working hard on this survey and to get so many responses in the past. The team was Francia Morales from TÜV Süd, who's also presenting the results in a minute, Antina Sander from 50 Hertz, and Anna Molchanova from the World Energy Council's team here in Berlin. All three of them, a big thank you to what you will be seeing in a minute, how people's reactions on our Energiewende actually looks like. And afterwards, we will have some reflections, discussions with the panel that I will introduce a little later. So with no further ado, Francia, I'd like to hand it over to you. And I guess we're all very curious what this year's results will look like.
Yes, thank you very much, Carsten, and welcome everybody to our webinar. Thank you for coming. As Carsten explained, this year's survey is an adapted version of the Blueprint for the World survey. We'll be looking at the 6th edition of this survey. This year, we were able to gather over 100 responses from almost 50 countries, meaning that we have a good variety of perspectives reflected. Our survey included both in-person and digital outreach in events like the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, as well as targeted outreach to our World Energy Council network online. And this means that you may also see either individual perspectives or group perspectives reflected, and we can't always differentiate between the two. But we're excited to share what these individuals or groups were able to tell us. And as one last caveat, we do want to make sure that you know that even though we make the survey every once in a while, the groups might differ, meaning that the answers from one survey to the next might not be directly comparable from one year to another. So we encourage you to look at these results as a snapshot of global expert opinion at this moment in time, as instead of a long-term trend, if you will. So to begin, I want to share the key takeaways that we saw first, the messages that most stood out to us as we were analyzing the results from this survey. The first is that the reputation of the German energy transition has worsened in the last 4 years. The second is that one of the persisting ideas regarding the energy transition is that it might not necessarily be expected to coincide or coexist with economic growth, contributing to concerns about its feasibility in general. And finally, increased international cooperation is still considered a priority to enable the global energy transition. I hope in the next 10 or 15 minutes to guide you through the data that shows us these ideas and maybe tell you this story in numbers. To begin, I want to give you a big picture of the general state of global climate targets. And as we can see here, 74% of respondents of the survey believe that only a few countries will be climate neutral or negative by 2050. In fact, more than 1/5 of responses claim that no country will reach this target at all. When people were asked what global or regional events are affecting respondents' countries' energy transitions, we see aspects like fires or floods, heat waves, or international agreements, all of which have to do with the general climate agenda or the general climate sector. But where we see the biggest impact are in non-climate related events, such as the war in Ukraine, the new US government and subsequent tariffs, as well as the energy crisis. These are things that don't necessarily have to do with the climate, but are heavily affecting the progress of the energy transition. We see that these larger geopolitical events are those that mainly affect the confidence, specifically, of the energy transition, especially the confidence in Germany's energy transition. If we look at Germany's climate targets more closely, respondents are overall pessimistic regarding their feasibility, especially among EU answers. Most believe that these targets will not be reached. In contrast to the results of our 2021 survey, we saw a 6 percentage point increase in those who report that they follow the German energy transition closely and know a lot about it. This means that we've seen an increase in visibility of Germany's energy transition. This might have to do with Germany's presence overall on the global stage, or in general, the increased salience of energy transitions as a whole. However, it is not only the visibility that has increased, but influence on other countries' policies or political debate as well. From 2021, the number of EU respondents who say that the German energy transition has contributed to concrete political decisions on energy has increased from 0 to 30%, and among all respondents, this figure increased by 18 percentage points. This was a pretty big increase. In general, those who say that the German energy transition is not noticed have fallen drastically as well, which really stood out to us as we analyzed the results. The world is, however, not particularly excited or necessarily excited about the German energy transition, as we can observe a very clearly declining reputation in the last 4 years. Still, despite the declining reputation, over 80% of respondents claim that all or parts of the current German energy policy could serve as a reference for other countries. The portion of non-EU respondents who share this opinion is over 90%. And this is an increase from in 2021 when non-EU respondents said, where 83% of non-EU respondents said the same thing. In fact, when asked about concrete policies within the German energy policy, both EU and non-EU respondents found that among German energy policy elements that they could adopt most of the policies that Germany looks at or has implemented. In addition to this, we observed that domestically, several German sectors are expected to benefit from the energy transition, especially innovation and research and development, and Germany's own climate targets. However, a higher share of respondents expect a more negative effect on economic prosperity, which was interesting to us because, in line with this observation, EU respondents consider energy security to be the main driver of energy transition, whereas economic growth is at the end of this list. Meanwhile, non-EU respondents cite climate protection and economic growth in particular as the main drivers of energy transition. They also were more inclined to include other varied reasons, such as protection of biodiversity and natural resources, as well as access to energy, things having to do more with providing needs, whereas in the EU, energy security is really the #1 priority at the moment. When it comes to Germany's cooperation abroad, EU neighbors find a clear cooperation deficit. This attitude spans across questions of energy policy coordination, which almost 60% of EU answers say are insufficient, hydrogen partnerships, which is one of Germany's priorities, as well as electricity interconnectedness, where we actually find the highest degree of satisfaction amongst Germany's neighbors. This observation on cooperation is an issue because generally respondents consider cooperation absolutely crucial to the global energy transition. On a global scale, 86% of respondents believe that bilateral climate and energy partnerships between Germany and other countries could make a difference in accelerating the global energy transition. 93% of non-EU answers think the same. Usually, when asked to elaborate, qualitative answers refer to opportunities to strengthen export markets outside the EU, possible knowledge transfers from Germany, as well as the importance of cooperations in which all parties can benefit. So in general, even though we see a growing, let's say, skepticism regarding the global energy transition or worries about its feasibility, we still see a persisting need or a persisting desire from countries or respondents to double down on cooperation and make sure that one way or another, global energy transitions advance and that all parties who are involved in them can benefit. So as a conclusion to this snapshot of our results and as a refresher, these three messages were the clearest when analyzing the international perspectives provided by participants. Since the last group was surveyed in 2021, we can observe a decline in the reputation of the German energy transition. And secondly, one of the persistent skepticisms regarding the energy transition is that it may not necessarily be compatible with economic growth, which is a concern among respondents, especially in the EU, as well as outside the EU. And thirdly, both regionally and globally, respondents consider increased international cooperation a priority to enable the global energy transition or to enable it to continue. So with that, I leave you for now. Thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in learning more about the global perspectives of the German energy transition or seeing the full results, the full messages from our survey, you can read the full report, which will be published today. And with that, I pass the floor back to Carsten for our expert panel. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Francia. And in fact, that was just a snapshot of a lot more that is in that dialogue, in that survey. I think what stands out, as you said, is compared to former years, the growing skepticism. Question I would have maybe first of all to you, as you are one of the few that knows very well also former survey results in the past. What could be a driver of this skepticism, especially within Europe? I think our European neighbors were a lot more skeptic than people and countries that are more far away from us. Do you have any idea? Is that some are related to Germany's economic performance? Are there other reasons you could identify?
Yeah, of course. So when we look at the qualitative answers, or let's say the open-ended questions that we asked our respondents, we can definitely see a huge impact of the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis that ensued from there. Of course, already from our past survey, the pandemic had already occurred, and many of the optimisms about Germany's feasibility to reach its climate targets were affected already, given the impact of the pandemic on the economy. And now there's been a doubling down since the war in Ukraine began and the energy crisis ensued, and there just had to be a rearrangement of priorities for Germany's policies as a whole, specifically in regards to its energy policies. And this definitely contributes to EU neighbors in particular feeling less optimistic about Germany's ability to reach its targets.
Absolutely. And of course, there has been a lot that Europe has jointly done together in really combating the crisis and managing the crisis. But nevertheless, one of the results was also that many European neighbors wish to see a closer cooperation and a closer interaction with Germany's and even with German energy policy, also in advance. That was one of the feedbacks I think we've also seen. And that might also hint to a political debate and one of the conclusions we can draw from that. Last question from me to you. Any surprise that stands out to you with all these results? I mean, anything that really surprised you in a way?
I think I've been looking at them for too long, but if I had to mention one thing that did surprise me was that although there is a general skepticism or pessimism regarding Germany's ability to reach its climate target, it seems that respondents overall are satisfied, or they agree in general or in principle with the policies that Germany implements. I think the only one that reached the most pushback in both qualitative and quantitative responses was the phase out of nuclear energy. But other than that, despite skepticism, respondents seem to agree with how Germany handles its policies overall, specifically its energy policies. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Franca.
Thank you, Carsten.
We'll take that into the debate now with our three experts that I'd like to briefly introduce. We have with us Markus Hicken, who is the Director of Energy Diplomacy, Climate and Security at the German Federal Foreign Office. Thank you very much, Markus, that you can make it. And he's, I think, a long-standing ally in many international energy debates for the last years. We have Mingxi Fu with us. She is the co-founder of Low Voltage Energy, a startup, especially dealing with integration of solar panels, customized solutions to companies, basically. And in former life, she was one of the future energy leaders, the young professional group of the World Energy Council. Last but not least, I'm happy to have Jürgen Weiss with us. He's the founder of Dash20, a platform discussing many issues around the Energiewende, the energy transition, but he has spent himself many years, 25 years and more, in consulting and teaching and really tackling many questions and topics of Energiewende in this context. And so by that, I think an excellent expert as well. Now, with our three experts, I'd like to start, Markus, in months where we don't know what to read first in newspapers, as there's so much going on in geopolitical changes, in conflicts and challenges for all of us. Did the results somehow surprise you? We saw that energy security is one of the drivers of energy transition in Europe. But is that something that comes as a news to you? Is that something you already incorporated in response of our way, our German way of addressing German energy policy?
Yes, thank you, Carsten. First of all, good afternoon to everybody in the call. I would like to thank the organizers for this survey. I'm happy we could contribute a little bit with our government BETD conference where you could collect parts of the insight. Well, you asked me, does it surprise me? Well, as a diplomat, it's obviously our job to be attuned to the currents of opinion in the neighboring countries. And as Europe's biggest economy, the Energiewende certainly has repercussions, for better or worse, also for our neighbors. And sometimes the road to net zero can certainly be a little bit bumpy, so we cannot expect a universal claim. Let's put it this way. I see, if I look at the skeptical views, I see on the negative side, I see two. I would like to comment on two reasons. I think one is a real one that was mentioned, where a more skeptical view reflects obviously the fact that the German economy was not doing well in the past couple of years, and this is obviously also one of the big priorities for the new government. The second point is a bit more on the, well, let me take this more carefully, but it's a bit more on the narrative side, or let's put it this way. I think we have seen also a bit of a spread of disinformation when it comes to energy policy and Energiewende. You know, you commented on having shut down our nuclear power plants, which is true, but well, very often this gets confused that we also have 60% power generation from renewables today, and we in Germany continue to have one of the most stable grids in the world. And you know, you read very often conflicting views on disinformation on that. On the positive side, I'm obviously very happy to see that the results leave a lot of work for diplomats. You talk about increased cooperation that is being seen as crucial for the success. We have entered in many partnerships on matters of energy, climate, raw materials, and so on, to create benefits on both ends. What I find unsettling is this statement that climate neutrality by 2050 is considered an unrealistic target for most countries. After all, we know why we are doing all of this, because, you know, I mean, well, it's warm enough. I think I don't need to say more, and we are not the worst, by far not the worst of the countries in the world. And we also know what is necessary to counteract it, and we have all the tools. So that I find a bit unsettling. And the second point, yes, we have to talk about the question of growth and market opportunities. I would actually, well, I don't like the view like it's just climate and it doesn't have any possibilities for growth. So I stop here and comment maybe later more. Thanks.
Thank you, Markus. From Europe to Asia to Mingxi, one of the results this year and also in the last survey was that responses from countries of other continents have been more positive than those within Europe regarding perception of German Energiewende. You're based in Singapore, I guess. You lived long you've been living long in China. What is your take or your view on German energy transition in a way? Is that a quite optimistic and positive way? Do you see challenges from far away that we might not see ourselves? So what's your impression of the survey results then?
Thank you first, the WECA Germany, to invite me to participate in this survey. And globally, this aligns with our expectation mostly. And as the leadership in Europe on energy transition, I think Germany plays a vital role in advancing the global climate responsibility while balancing energy affordability and security through international cooperations. The country has demonstrated its commitment through ambitious policies such as the Renewable Energy Act, the incentive for energy transitions and decarbonizations, and also the Grid Expansion Acceleration Act. All these critical steps towards a sustainable future, actually. So we know that that has some uncertain area during the recent period, but I think Germany can also succeed the leadership, and they must also accelerate legislative progress. For example, decreasing the permitting from 10 years to 4 years, maybe even shorter, 2 years, or even in some specific areas, just 1 year if possible. And I think also Germany can also reach the target of carbon neutrality as 2045, right? So only through those sustainable and decisive actions, we think that Germany can ensure a successful energy transition that serves as a model for the world.
Thank you. And in fact, China is pushing so hard in developing energy transition technologies for global markets very successfully, and for itself going forward with electrification, with renewables, as well as using coal, both at the same time. Very different from the US, to turn to Jürgen, is based in the US, where the country, especially under this government, that seems to focus a bit more on gas, basically on fossil energies, at least in the narrative, to some extent, maybe also in reality. That's part of the question already. What does that do with your view, or the US view, on Europe and in Germany's energy transition? How we're doing is that, well, somehow leading us apart, or do you see still close connection and many things that we have in common.
Thanks, Karsten, and thanks to the Weltenergierat for inviting me. I'm going to try not to comment too much on U.S. energy policy right now. It's like another kind of energy transition, except in the wrong direction, I suppose. But so I'll blend a little bit my own observations. So I've spent a little bit more than half my year in the U.S. and the other half, the earlier half, in Europe, and continue to follow Germany quite a bit. So I think the things that are most talked about in the U.S. are that this is all very expensive. And, I think people arguing against what Germany has been doing would look at things like electricity prices and draw a pretty straight line conclusion that obviously, electricity prices are high, therefore moving from fossil energy or fossil electricity to other forms, primarily renewables, is a bad idea based on just that one fact, that observation, not a fact, right? So and I think the grain of truth in that is that electricity prices are high, right? And so I think if I had to sort of make a broader statement, globally, that is becoming a real obstacle to the extent that the overall shift to non-greenhouse gas emitting energy resources does translate into higher energy prices. That does create an important barrier to faster increasing the speed of the transition. And I think, that's just like my own observations, that does not necessarily have anything to do at all with the underlying technologies that Germany or other countries are shifting to. So there are sort of side effects. Sometimes they're related, sometimes they're temporary, and sometimes they have nothing to do with the energy transition, right? So I'm just going to mention things that Americans generally don't understand is how much taxes are imposed on electricity prices in Germany, which, if you're trying to encourage electrification of the economy, maybe imposing super high taxes on electricity is maybe not the way to go. But it doesn't have anything to do with the underlying cost of the renewables, right? So, and that's really an observation. Now I'm going to make an observation about both the US and Europe. I noticed that the middle highlight was that there was skepticism about whether or not the energy transition had a positive impact on economic development. And I think that may well be tied, again, to the observation that energy is pretty expensive in Germany, right? I think that sentiment, in my view, has to do with two failures of people sort of coming to that conclusion. One, and they both have to do with the but-for world in some ways. So the first one is, it's easy to compare, say, energy costs today, post a partial transition to renewables, with what people remember in the past. But that may not be the right comparison, right? So that comparison fails to take into account what economic growth in general, economic performance looks like in a world where there is continued unabated, levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And, I'm currently in France where it's 38 or 39 degrees. So there are going to be economic consequences of not transitioning, of continuing to sort of burn a bunch of fossil fuels. And I think the general population, definitely in the United States, does not really make that comparison. How expensive is our energy system? How good is our economic performance in a transitioning economy versus one where we didn't transition at all, and therefore temperatures have increased by whatever, 2, 3, 4 degrees centigrade. So that's one. And the other one is sort of coming back to something I said a minute ago. People sort of equate the higher current energy costs to somehow the transition being expensive, or the end state of the transition being expensive, more expensive than the idealized, status prior to transition, when in reality, a lot of the technologies that are being deployed are already cheaper than their fossil equivalent. And they could be a lot cheaper than their fossil equivalent, and they could be cheaper. They will be cheaper in the future because those are new technologies that are still benefiting from important learning and scaling effects. And then this goes back to maybe something that Minchi said. And then there are reasons why some of these technologies are more expensive in Germany or in the United States than there are in other places. And I think that really, if I had to sort of focus on an area of policy that deserves more attention, that is, I'm making these presentations and see purchase power, from solar plants in Saudi Arabia is like $10 a megawatt hour, which is like, 20% of a new gas-fired power plants. So it's really, really cheap. But consumers see the cost of electricity as being much higher. So I think it's important to focus on how to find ways to translate the progress in the underlying technologies. Solar and batteries are probably the two primary ones. Wind a little less because it's more mature. But finding ways that these things ultimately translate into lower costs for consumers, so that there is a shift in the perception of whether this transition actually is expensive. And I'll say one more thing. This has nothing to do with the U.S. perspective, except for the U.S. is a 350 million, roughly, consumer market. China is a 1.2, 1.3 billion consumer market. India, 1.3 billion. Germany is 85 million people. Vietnam has a population that's not quite twice the size of Germany's, right? So Germany by itself is a small country. It's still a big economy, but it's a small country. And I think part of the reason why this is expensive is that there isn't a European energy transition. There is a German energy transition. There is a French energy transition that looks in areas totally opposite to the German energy transition. And there is a Belgian one and an Italian one. And so I think, so I'm echoing the conclusion of the survey that not just cooperation, just understanding that Europe is a single market for energy, or supposed to be, and therefore tackling this thing as EU 27 as opposed to as Germany plus France would sort of alleviate a lot of the problems that are being identified. And I'll stop there.
Very good point. Thank you, Jürgen. And just to take up your note on electricity costs, well, we have to find ways to translate generation costs into lower system costs and prices. And I think this government at least announced to reduce electricity taxation as one element of this extra burden that we're referring to. Let's see what the results will be in the end. This is just under discussion now for a couple of days. But Marcus, taking the European issue Jürgen was mentioning, and that was also part of the survey that we've seen. What makes you optimistic that this ongoing hope that we will really establish a European energy market, electricity market, gas market, will be progressing beyond the levels that we've seen so far, and maybe also to coordinate our national energy policies that to some extent will stay national, at least for the time being. I think there's also some consensus on that among European countries, but the need to further coordinate these national policies is growing, as we see. We need the price signals, we need the infrastructures that help us together to make use of the synergies that we do see, but we do not ripe really all the benefits that are possible. So what makes you optimistic that in the next years there will be a new attempt and really a step forward that Jürgen was calling for?
Wow, that's an easy question. Okay, well, first of all, I agreed with a lot of what Jürgen just said, and I come back to that. But on your question, I think far beyond our topic today, in the big picture, first of all, we have to get it right. We have to get our economy going again, growing again, reduce bureaucracies or the really big goals that there are. And this applies obviously also to the energy side. We have those national measures, and you mentioned one. I mean, it's totally right. We have a heated debate right now in Germany on the taxation, on the German taxation on electricity. But I think we also we have, nevertheless, it's not like that we have no European energy policy or no European coordination. There's a lot of growing together happening, and we need to increase this. And I think it's about combining the pure energy issues with the competitiveness issues, as the Clean Industry Deal is trying. But again, it starts with doing our own homework at home, making the energy transition we are doing successful, while, and this is important, while not forgetting our neighbors. Doing it together with our neighbors. But there are some limits, because we still ascribe to the view that each nation is in charge of its own energy mix. So obviously there are diverging views on that, and diverging signals. But on the other hand, it's it's in many respects working on the European level. I mean, there is a heavy exchange of, there's heavy trading also on electricity. And while I know that there are some countries claiming that high German or European prices, it's not only the German prices, have impact on their national prices, the same countries are also making, like the Nordics, are making enormous profits on a society, on an economy level with that, and have also an alternative to buy cheap electricity when we have too much renewables. So we need to do our homework. I think this is the most important one, and this is where I subscribe to what Jürgen said. The issue of perception of cost is a very important one. But let me make one comment on that. Well, you know, you can obviously rightly argue that our electricity and energy prices in general are too high, yes, but we have just actually seen what the costs are of being too dependent on fossil fuels. You know, much of the cost increases we have seen since your last survey were due to fossil fuel problems, were due to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and and which also obviously had an impact on growth in general. And so in that respect, the survey is quite consistent, having a turn to the negative on that side. But as Jürgen also said, and Minchi also said, this is not necessarily a question of renewables, because they are often very much cheaper. It's a question of how do we get this cheaper price also in general into the market.
And absolutely, and the preconditions differ so much between at least the three continents, Europe, Asia, and North America. And that's why also the share in the energy mix is so different. Looking to China with these high share of coal, and at the same time this enormous speed in building renewables. I think last year 70% of all wind and solar capacities that were installed in the G20, we learned last week, were built in China, I guess mostly with Chinese technology. So there is an enormous long-term plan, very ambitious plan. And on the other hand side, in terms of gas, the US is going more that way, in having really a strong emphasis on making use of their gas reserves, gas and oil reserves. Mingxi, if Europe and China in this respect might be a bit more similar in terms of what are at least Germany and China in terms of the direction, at least in electrification, we're heading towards increasing the share of renewables. Maybe not that much on the way we trade and treat coal in that mix, but at least on the renewable side. What could we learn maybe from China, not the other way around, in these terms of framework conditions, of long-term stability, of conditions? Is there anything you've identified as a success factor to China that could be adopted also by European countries like Germany?
At first, actually, China always launch 5 years plans. For example, 15 years ago, we have air pollutions. We launched the Blue Sky plan to improve air qualities. And then we also launched several other plans on the renewable side. So renewable energy continues to dominate China's national policy discussion, and it's never stopped. Though we recognize there are still considerable progress to be made, much like Europe's ongoing transitions. The challenges is very complex and far-reaching also, just as transmitting electricity from Portugal to Turkey requires more than simple coordinations. So our energy transitions from Xinjiang to Shanghai, or from the Yunnan province to Guangdong province, the renewable reaches area to the industrial areas. It was quite a challenging and a comprehensive problem also for us. But we are still keeping searching and keeping looking and keep focusing on this transition. There has a popular saying that's emerged among the energy professionals. In China, the policy rollout always outpaces our ability to keep up. Just like 2 days ago, during the weekend, for example, the state grid from the south initialized the daily cross-province electricity tradings across 5 southern provinces, with the transaction electricity volume already surpassing billions of kilowatt hours. And the policies is keeping, we can see every day, it's we need to learn every time. And once we analyze this new policy and another new policy comes out, so we always keep up to learning and to improving the process. And in the same time, we also focusing on developing relationship with foreign companies, with international companies. For example, 1 week ago, we signed a 25 project during the Shanghai SCOC meetings, with a contract value about 5 billion euros and a total installed capacities of 12 gigawatts. So that was also demonstrating our ambition to the regional energy transitions. Maybe it can adapt it also globally, and we wish we can also focus the cooperation altogether worldwide, and to make the carbon neutrality successful.
Thank you, Minxi. And I think we even have a chart on what Germany can learn from other countries. Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, other policies, technologies, innovations applied in your country that you believe Germany's energy transition could learn from. And we see that, yes, there's 2/3 almost who believe that there are, especially within Europe. Well, some refer to nuclear, and that's a very basic debate and a very sensitive debate, which is probably not that easy to meet. But there are many other items that were mentioned, I think, beyond that, that we could also try to reach out to other countries. Last question I'd like to address to Jürgen, then I want to open it also to questions from the audience, is on another result that we haven't shown yet. It seems to be just a detail, but it might be a detail of relevance, because with the results of the climate conference in Baku last year, the negotiations around the so-called Article 6, so the possibility to make use of a flexibility mechanism that allows to count mitigation efforts outside of your country or your entity, Europe, abroad, into into our climate efforts. And by that, trading actually certificates of mitigation efforts is allowed. That was somehow completed and can be now taken up by entities like the European Union, for instance. And there's the question I think we raised. Do you think that the EU should implement these provisions to allow for counting mitigation efforts abroad under this Article 6? German government, the new German government actually addresses this already in their coalition negotiation paper. So they want to make use of that. I think that's a good idea, at least to a limited extent, with high quality standards of these certificates. That is a necessary prerequisite after the somehow difficult experiences we made with CDM a couple of years ago. But the answers here are quite balanced. So my question, Jürgen, is do you think that is an instrument that we will see and should see in the future, also in terms of bringing private capital to the global south, even in times where public spending on climate is going more and more under pressure? Do you see that this will be one way that helps us?
All right, so that's the easiest question of the day, I suppose. So I could answer that in a multiple ways. So one, by the way, my interpretation of looking at the results here is that people have no idea. So it's like just there isn't a clear feeling one way or another, and I think in part that just reflects a general confusion. And the confusion is understandable because there are just arguments that come from very different directions. So one, I'm an economist by training, and I've developed a macroeconomics of climate change course for the IMF. Economists are very comfortable with the idea that you equalize marginal abatement costs across the world, and that suggests that, yeah, I mean, rather than spending whatever amount per ton of emissions reductions in Germany, if we can spend 1/10 of that for emissions reductions elsewhere, we should go for it. Well, that's the basic argument for offsets, right? But you mentioned the CDM, right? I think the downside of all of this is, in theory, it all sounds good. The practical experience was basically horrible so far, where it became clear that in order to have confidence that the offsets, I'm going to call them offsets, the offsets you're buying are actually what you call high quality, you need to put into place very elaborate structures and if it's more than just a thing at the margin, then the amount of money at stake is such that it pays for very expensive lawyers and accountants to figure out ways to cheat the system. And that's exactly what happened, not all the time, but happened a lot, I think, in the first couple of rounds of trying this. So that's sort of two arguments. The third argument I'd make is I think it's a bit of an illusion, although it's a very typical paradigm to say, well, the first 80 or 90% of decarbonization are going to be relatively easy. It's the final 10%, they're going to be really hard, and it makes no sense to spend a lot of money per ton of carbon removed or avoided in Germany or in France if you could, get the same emissions reduction someplace else at a much lower cost. I think that's generally not a bad argument in a static sense if you just look at today or the next few years. I think there is also a counter argument, which is if you're buying into that approach, then you're buying into a partial decarbonization, and then the goalpost is unclear. And it creates a lot of policy uncertainty that has impacts on the need for innovation and the need to make societal commitments to a totally different system, right? And it ignores the potential changes to prices as for example, in a world that, where Germany uses the amount of petroleum that it currently uses in the transportation sector, or the amount of natural gas it uses in the heating and industrial sector. The cost of gas or the cost of petroleum is one thing. If you're reducing that by 85 or 90%, you would actually make petroleum and gas a lot more expensive for the remaining few percent. And often when you think about the sort of partway solution, that part is missed. So I think there are benefits to just committing to the 100% solution in the long run. So you obviously need a transition. And you don't rely on others to do the final few percent, which enables a more profound technological transformation that may actually result in a cheaper final outcome than having that new set of technologies only provide 90% of the answer and then rely on legacy technologies for the other 10%. So that's not an answer, right? I think in theory, offsets could play a role. My casual observations, I've never been to any COPs, but my casual observations is that agreeing to these things, developing the frameworks, the protocols, the verification mechanisms is something that keeps lots of diplomats gainfully employed and lots of negotiators and lots of organisms. But the objective results from having tried this in the past don't suggest to me that's a no-brainer to include that. And I'll stop there.
Absolutely, and I guess it's at least one attempt to overcome the different emission levels somehow internationally that we still have. I don't know whether Markus, you'd like to react on that immediately. If not, so I would open the question, but I first look at you. Okay, then.
Open to the question. I like most of it. What you said.
Okay. Then it is up to you to raise questions to our three panelists or to Francia, who's also with us, and can look whether we have further results that could respond to your questions one way or another. And I see a first hand by Jonas Heid.
Hello, thank you. Yes, Mr. Hicken, I think this question goes to you. You were saying that it's difficult to spread awareness of how cheap renewable energies can be. And I represent the VIK, the German Industrial Energy Association, the Industrial Energy Consumer Association. And for us, it's quite the opposite. We struggle with explaining to people how expensive the system of renewables will be, simply because right now we can already not afford the prices. And we can see that there's no I don't know the English phrase for there doesn't seem to be an other side of the bridge that we're jumping towards, because we need incredible storage capacity. We need that storage capacity to last for weeks in some parts during the winter. We need day-to-day storage for the day-night cycle. And so we're a little bit concerned about those prices that are going to be in there. What's your view on how industrial energy consumers are going to be able to afford this green future?
Markus, you like to react?
Yes, I'll try. Thanks for your question. Yes, obviously, you're rightly concerned with high prices. But my argument was, first of all, the question is what's the alternative? I personally do not think we have any alternative of not doing decarbonization, and we are all, if we want to and are willing to, see the reasons for that. The second point is, and that's where you rightly come in, we have to insist that the way we do the decarbonization, we really have to discuss constantly how we combine it with competitiveness, price, cost efficiency, and so on. And this is where the discussions are ongoing. But then again, I mean, I'm a diplomat, not in the energy ministry. But all what I see is not that continuing the way we are or doing just remaining with fossil. I mean, also taking into account where CO2 prices are going to go, are any alternative. And so that means we now have to find out how we do this gigantic task. It's a totally change of a system in a way that also our industry survives. And my impression is that this government and also the previous government, they have looked at a lot of ways of, especially helping the industries. I mean, if you know very well the discussion of today's, why do we do something for the industry and not directly for the consumer? On the tax issue. This is the reason is, well, They might do also something for the consumer, but the reason why we are starting with the industry is obviously the industry needs now some support to remain competitive. So it's necessary to look more, and this also was what Jürgen alluded to, about European cooperation on infrastructure, on innovation, not doing just a German thing, because you also obviously need as much level playing field as possible. But in a way, well, let's give the question back. What would be your alternative? What would be your alternative, and not only just more subsidies to one sector, because every sector is asking for that.
I would be happy to briefly answer that, if I may.
Maybe Jürgen has the answer. I see at least a hand of you. Is that also referring to the same question?
Yeah, no, I can jump in, but I'm curious what Jonas thinks. So I had three points. One is there is a political economy piece where in the end it's individuals that vote in elections, and therefore I think the energy price to end users who happen to also be voters is particularly important. Point one. Point two, I guess the quick answer from the EU would be carbon border adjustment mechanisms, perhaps to some extent. That yeah, if it's more expensive to produce stuff in the EU because of the energy transition and therefore reducing the carbon content of the products, then one way to level the playing field would be with various attempts at carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Not sure how easy or successful, right? Doing this broad is very, very hard. Doing it for a couple of targeted industries may be successful, but gets tricky after that. And the third point, which is actually the hardest one, I think. So there is a fundamental, so this is the opportunity to talk about hydrogen strategies, perhaps, I don't know. But what I see from the distance is the desire, and Jonas, the entity you represent presumably is in that camp, is like, we want to maintain these industries in Germany. And I don't know how easy that's going to be. And for the simple reason that, so if I were China and continuing on its trajectory, at some point I would impose a carbon border adjustment mechanism on stuff that comes from elsewhere that continues to use that fossil stuff, which means there is going forward going to be a question about where energy intensive industries locate. Do they, and I think there is already, I wrote a case on Northvolt, which we probably don't get into, but Northvolt's decision of where to locate its German plant, which obviously is not going to work anymore, I suspect, is to do it in northern Germany, even though all the demand for its products is in southern Germany. And they did that because in northern Germany, they have access to cheap, clean electricity, which they need for their production. And I think that's symbolic for potentially symbolic for a larger trend where energy intensive industries will be increasingly looking to locate in places where there is access to abundant, clean, cheap energy, ideally in countries that have the other macroeconomic sort of characteristics that allow for, if I were to go long on a country, Australia would be a great example, right? Where they just have incredible resources. They have a pretty stable government. So that's the kind of place where that would be attractive. And I would ask myself, at the German political level, can Germany really compete with that situation in a world that transitions to cleaner energy supplies, completely independent of what Germany chooses as its kind of political strategy?
That is leading us to the very big industrial policy questions and the strategies in Germany that we're discussing in these days. How closely linked are different branches, energy intensive, and the next ones in the value chain? And is that really possible to separate those, or are they in a cluster really closely linked, and the success of one is the success of the other as well? We will not find the answer.
Can you hear Jonas's comment? I would want to hear Jonas's suggestion. Can we hear Jonas's answer?
I would restrict myself to a very brief answer and not take up too much of your time. I see there's other questions already waiting. we're not against decarbonization. I just want to make that very, very clear. It's not that the energy intensive industry says, no, let's stay in the past. Obviously, that has to happen. I think the point was more, it's a huge struggle for us to communicate with politicians that there is no safe place, no safe landing for us on the other side of that energy transition, unless the politicians create one, which, as Mr. Weiss just explained, is going to be incredibly difficult. I don't know if it's possible, but we struggle trying to communicate that actually there isn't just going to be green, cheap electricity for all of us. And if only we wanted it, and it would be fine. And that we're kind of the villains for not wanting it and not wanting to decarbonize. They definitely do want to decarbonize. It's in their interest. They have children, you know, the CEOs of the worst climate polluters have children who are going to live in the future, and they're aware of this. So I think it's not a communication issue in that regard. It's very much an issue of being afraid of there being no price level on the other side that we're going to be able to afford. And I'd also be very curious, Ms. Fu, perhaps you can answer, actually, regarding carbon border adjustment, we don't see a safety net there for the reasons that Mr. Weiss just explained as well, but also because we are very curious how China will actually react to something like this and what kind of things we can expect in terms of even splitting energy demands to perhaps sell green steel to Europe as a classic example, by making just the steel with green energy and then just allocating what energy is green, what energy isn't green, and where it's being distributed, if you understand what I'm saying. So yeah, we have a lot of worries and not a lot of answers.
I don't want to get stuck in the CBAM, but a brief reaction from Mingxi, because there are many answers to the carbon border mechanism and how it resonates in different countries. But Mingxi, what's your take? How do you look at it? As a threat?
I will make it
as
short as possible. So I will thank Europe first. Actually, Europe helped China to decarbonize, to make very ambitious target. We must decarbonize, otherwise we have no European market. That's a good stuff. And secondly, concerning the supply chain transparency and the carbon emission regulation, we actually make a effort on cooperating with the European commissions, and also we would like to open an opportunity to discuss in the future episodes, because we are going to also launch like China Fail national team in September. So maybe next episode we can discuss more about the China's supply chain transparency.
Great. And well, we take this CBAM debate maybe to another occasion, because this is really a tough one when it gets very practical and really implementing and making sure it has the effects that are intended. I see a second question from Sven Egenter.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all of you for a really insightful presentation, a very good discussion. Good to see familiar faces as well, who've been following Clean Energy Wire since 2014, as I know. I just want to share an observation which I find from our work over the past 10 years with over 2,000 individual journalists, with media from across the world, and people who ask questions about Germany a lot. I would like to share that now, because I find it important when you look at the way certain elements of German energy policy are perceived. It depends on two things. One, not only, but obviously it always depends on the facts, but it depends on two more things. One is the starting point from the other side. Where is that other country? Where is this other economy in its own global positioning, ultimately? And the second one is, let's say, the domestic debate here in Germany and how that translates into the international context. What do I mean? In this new media world in which we are living, there is no top-line comment that any CEO, any politician, any activist makes that doesn't travel across the world on certain things. And very often it travels without context. And we've seen this during the election campaign in Germany, where we got played back questions about each and individual politician. I'm sure the World Energy Council had the same thing. It's like, what do they mean when they say windmills are ugly? Does that mean they will stop windmill. We know why we in Germany know why that comment was made and who it was so targeting. But if that travels as a headline via social media, it then opens the door, as Markus Hicken rightly pointed out, going from misinformation, offering a perfect entry point for disinformation. So the starting point was a contextual misunderstanding, if you want, and then it travels into, and that's the other thing, the starting point of a country. When you ask people how do they like energy transition, and I would like to get Jürgen's and Minchi's view on this, really, it depends on where the other side is. Our experience with Nord Stream 2 and the nuclear exit and renewables was a lot of the criticism of the nuclear exit was played to us, not because people like nuclear that much, but because of the worry that it would lead to a stronger connection and dependency on Russia. And then, it feels again like, that context often doesn't travel into the German debate. But I'd really like to hear, all of your views on that, but especially also with the question, how should we handle that going forward in order to take sort of for those people in charge the right conclusions from what they're hearing and saying and hearing and seeing in these comments on Germany's energy transition. Thanks.
The context is key. Well understood, but the question is how to bring this context in the different energy debates to really make sure that they're not misunderstood. That was somehow the question, as I understood.
Yes,
right?
Indeed. How well. First of all, I mean, Jürgen and Minchi probably must know that from own experience because you're competent on the subject, but you're seeing the public debates evolve that are ultimately shaping the view in the US and that are ultimately shaping the view in China. And obviously, Markus Hicken, through the embassies, you probably get the same sort of feedback. And I'm just curious, how that has played out in your view over the last few years. And, also ultimately the big question then is what to do about it.
Thank you. That's what we also try, by the way, with World Energy Council's work, to bring a little bit of that context. But Markus, curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. I mean, we have experienced over the years. Well, let me put it this way: we have experienced over the years a totally change of the discussion also in other ways. I mean, let me take the example of the BETD, the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue. Quite frankly, when this started a good 10 years ago, it started to show the world what we were doing because there was a lot of interest from the rest of the world. But what it has evolved into today is basically much more that we equally learn from the rest of the world, that we are comparing with the rest of the world. Okay, what are you doing? What are we doing? And Sven rightly referred to the perception is different from the starting points are different, and and that's where you have to bring issues together. So in that respect, the issue is evolving. The other point is in my perception, and this came up in the survey, the whole issue, and we didn't discuss this too much now, but the issue of energy security is a totally different one today. And, I mean, it pains me almost to say, but if there was one silver lining from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, is that many countries here in Europe have a totally different view on the energy transition in terms of energy security, because we have seen how dependent one can be on fossil fuels. And other countries see this also today. I mean, we see what happens in the market when there's turmoil in the Middle East. So there is a much heightened view of the importance of energy security and the role the energy transition can play in it. But then again, and I don't mean this blaming the media, but one thing I almost find puzzling. We discuss for several years now, for example, the question of REPowerEU. EE is a European program to get independent of Russian fossil fuels. But what in the media, apart from specialized agencies and so on, 90% of the discussion goes about what we do about gas. but it's an equally important part of the medal. How do we switch over to renewables? How we do energy efficiency and the goals which were also underlined in COP28. So yeah, so it's very much a matter of perception, and I think it's partly also our job to always. I wouldn't say rectify, but make the other points as well and comment on wherever possible politically, not always, on the issue of narratives. Thanks.
Taking up what Marcus is just saying on energy security, diversification is one of the key answers. And I think we do have an interesting result also in the survey, Francia, on the need or the perception of our German way to address that in hydrogen terms by pushing hydrogen partnerships, hydrogen dialogues with many countries around the globe. Because we were asked, is that an instrument that is well established and seen positively by the partners abroad? And I think the result was, especially within Europe, very positive. I don't know whether you will find the chart that we will see maybe the result. It differs a bit between answers from Europe and from outside Europe. That's what we see in the two bars on the left, EU answers and non-EU answers. But and I read the question again to you, Marcus. Do you think that the current policy instruments are sufficient to enable a productive hydrogen partnership between Germany and your country? And the majority in Europe says, yes, these are the instruments that we need. Make use of them. That's it. Others see a need for further instruments, maybe subsidy instruments, I don't know. But what's your take also on our approach of addressing, well, those bilateral dialogues, as long as we don't see really a global hydrogen market yet, especially not for green hydrogen in the scale that we wish to see? Is that bringing us closer to where we want this whole development going? Or do you see a need for additional instruments here?
Another easy question. Well, on the hydrogen side, we have seen that the big hype which we had experienced has a bit changed. There's much more skepticism about the development of this nascent hydrogen market, and I would assume the slide you have shown reflects this. So what can we do? What should we do? Well, I mean. I mean, there are a lot of issues, a lot of problems which need to be overcome, and I do not claim to have answers for all of them. But if we think about what do we want and where do we want to go to, it's like I would say our success will probably be measured by long-term outcomes. Are we becoming resilient? Are we creating a mutual benefit? Will it be sustainable? This is where we have to go, and that must mean we have to offer, as Germany and the EU in total to the outside world, we have to offer long-term partnerships that are attractive and that are reliable to our competitors. On a foreign policy view, one of the reasons the Foreign Office is doing hydrogen diplomacy in very close cooperation with our colleagues in the Energy Ministry is, well, if we assume that the fossil world will come to an end, then a lot of countries have a big problem with their business model. And the countries that have a big problem with their business model don't tend to be stable, but we will rather see more conflicts, and we are not interested in that. So producing green hydrogen can be at least a part of diversification also for other countries. So what can we do? We have to offer our partner countries, and partner countries in hydrogen can be over everywhere, basically. I think we have to be moving beyond a mere extravist approach, like we have to be like a real it's not just a trading relationship. It should be a trading relationship, but also more technology, capacity building, local value creation. This is what people tell us what they want. In the end, obviously, we want and we need secure supplies. Also, as Germany, I mean, we need those products in those hard to abate sectors. And what we can also do as Germany, helping to align the regulatory frameworks. I think there's a lot on that level which needs to be done also in the European contracts. But the hydrogen looks much more tricky looks much more tricky today than 3 years ago, maybe. Thanks.
Absolutely, and thank you. And maybe one of the answers could be, especially for those countries outside Europe, developing countries and others, to broaden also what we put into these corporations, raw material issues, industrialization issues, and all of that. These countries are striving for, and that there's a lot of room and a lot of potential that we can offer and bring into these corporations. Maybe I'll look into.
Can I jump in for a little bit? So I don't know. I don't know whether we answered Sven's question really, but I can't help on the hydrogen stuff because Marcus mentioned the countries that will lose from a transition away to fossil fuels. Just to illustrate what I mentioned earlier to Jonas, I think. So take Saudi Arabia, right? So you would think pretty dependent on selling oil, but very aggressive now. Building out solar and pretty aggressive in building out hydrogen. So this is a partner, except I think the interests are not aligned. So by the time, if the Germany strikes a deal with Saudi Arabia, get delivery of green hydrogen into where basic German industry sits, the cost of that hydrogen will be a significant multiple of the cost of that hydrogen in Saudi Arabia. I.e., making that hydrogen costs X, and then making the hydrogen, transferring it into a form that you can stick on a tanker or a ship, shipping it to Germany, reconverting it into what you can use, you end up with 2 or 3 or 4X. And so therefore, what I would think is the industrial policy, the idea of Saudi Arabia is we're going to attract basic chemical manufacturing to Saudi Arabia, as opposed to having a great 20-year deal to send green hydrogen to Germany. And I think that's the basic tension that I sort of alluded to early on with Jonas. And I want to say something to Sven. I mean, I think it is kind of tricky to figure out. These things are always based on local conditions. And so I think if I'm a other country and I look at Germany, I think it's important to understand what's different in Germany and what's very Germany specific, right? So from the US, France, I'm currently in France, right? I mean, the nuclear exit is something that's pretty incomprehensible, right? But so you have to understand a lot about the skepticism against nuclear to even sort of begin to understand the rationale for that. The more tricky ones are, and I hope we're going to spend a couple minutes, the transportation sector or the coal phase out, right? So the transportation sector, if I had to point to one sector where Germany is doing a really horrible job, it's the transportation sector. And it's entirely explained or explainable by the view, in my view, very misplaced, that somehow forcing the important German automobile sector to transition quickly to an electric vehicle sort of state will put that industry at risk. And there's just so much political power and so many kind of emotions around that industry that it's just seems to be impossible to kind of do what China is doing. It's like, okay, this is going to be the technology of the future. We're going to go for it. And I think, in my view, that's one gigantic risk for the German economy overall, that with this kind of wait and see and technology neutrality and let's go slow approach, that is a feature of German politics, you actually make it more likely that the German car industry, at least in terms of manufacturing cars in Germany, is going to go away pretty fast, right? The coal, just quickly, I saw that the coal phase out was perceived as a good thing in the German energy transition. Obviously, if you're into decarbonization, you find coal phase out a good thing, but it's late. I mean, so right. So this is tied to the nuclear phase out in some sense. We've basically kept the coal industry all around because we're losing all the power from nuclear generation. And there are a bunch of sort of local economic conditions that make it very difficult to phase out coal. If I'm the UK, I go like, I don't know, why is Germany a good example for how to decarbonize? UK doesn't have coal plants anymore. And a bunch of other countries don't either. So I think that those things, to Sven's point, those things are explained by extremely local things. And you just got to accept that that means different paths that have to respect these local things. But beyond the local things, there are certain sort of evolutions that will be universally true. I'll go back to the car industry. I might be proven wrong about this, but if somebody thinks that, the internal combustion engine is going to be around and cost competitive in 20 or 30 years, and therefore the likes of VW and all the German manufacturers will be happy making ICE cars, I think that's misunderstanding the sort of a global technology trend, and a case where sort of the local conditions and the misunderstanding in the general population and in the press leads to economic policies that I find very, very risky. That was a long thing to say. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure whether we have anyone from the car industry in our call, because I guess there will be strong views in the automotive sector itself, that there is a lot going on in this sector in Germany in terms of the variety of cars, electric cars that are developed and at least offered. But in fact, political framework conditions to buy these cars have changed, and you can talk about the speed of building the infrastructures, the charging infrastructure and these items. But that would be a debate in itself. What you've referred to, what are elements of our German Energiewende that are interesting and is broader. And in fact, the coal phase out has been mentioned by other countries as an interesting element, rightly so, as we know that in the past, new energies often just tend to be added to the existing ones. So inventing renewables did not automatically mean that coal or peat or other energies would disappear. So we have to think also by pricing elements, by other elements, to make sure that emissions from coal, for instance, will not be seen, and at least moderating a coal phase out politically, as we have done in the past, seems to be an element for many countries that is worth looking at in bringing together these interests that are related. And there are many countries we just saw, not only China, but also India, Indonesia in particular, where coal demand is still rising, and that is, of course, something we have to address, because it is going and hinting into the wrong direction. We are almost at the end of our time, so I'm just looking whether there's any very urgent question we haven't answered yet. But as I don't see another hand, I'd like to thank you, Markus, Mingxi, Jürgen, all of you, for your contributions. That was very valuable in really getting a bit more out of the results and in the sense of where we have to put these results. But also, again, a big thank you to Francia, to Antina and Anna for giving us the insights and organizing and bringing together all these views from, 48 countries, I guess it was, around the globe. That was very insightful, and we will bring not only today's session, but also the results on our website. So if you're interested now in looking a bit deeper into results, you will find them on the World Energy Council Germany's website in a couple of minutes or hours, I don't know. So thank you very much for all your attention, and see you back for our next session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.